Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Nury Turkel. I'm a senior fellow here at the Hudson Institute. 20 years ago, when China joined the WTO, Western leaders thought that engagement would eventually lead to China becoming more liberal, open, and even democratic. They also believed that China would import one of the democracy's most cherished values, economic freedom, which would lead Chinese people to demand a greater say in how they were governed. But looking back, these views seem, however well-intentioned that might be, hopelessly naive. My guest today is Bethany Allen, an award-winning China reporter for Axios in Taipei. She's an acclaimed journalist on contemporary China. Her new book, displayed here, Beijing Rules: How China Weaponized Its Economy to Confront the World, brings to light China's 2 decades-long quest for global dominance and how China's Communist Party, the CCP, co-opted capitalism that Western countries have long considered as the most powerful tool for protecting and promoting liberal democracy. This terrific book that I highly recommend you to get includes stories of Western institutions bowing to Beijing's pressure. This gives us a glimpse of what America could be like if liberal democracy is replaced by the system where the government is controlled by authoritarian capitalism. In this deep investigative reporting, Bethany sounds the alarm about what we must do to prevent the loss of freedom now we take for granted. The book makes some thoughtful policy recommendations at the end, including relinking trade and democratic values and making new rules to compel American companies to comply. Bethany, thank you so much for your incredible work, and it's great to welcome you back. Let me start by asking your initial interest in China, your visits to the country years ago, and subsequent journalism covering China. I know for a fact that you've been mostly covering China. I've been a huge fan of yours, and thank you for being a truth teller, including your incredible work at the ICIJ, publishing the China cables. So during those time that you spend in China and during your reporting and during the process of writing this book, did you find anything surprising? And can you tell us about your interests, your journalism work, or if anything that you find surprising during the process of writing this book project?
Sure, and thank you so much, Nury, for the invitation to come and speak today, and thank you to everyone here in person and online who's tuning in. I first went to China in 2004 when I was in undergrad, just at a study abroad program, and I knew nothing about China. I was basically a blank slate. I had never even had American Chinese food when I went. I knew truly nothing about it. And I went to Xiamen, which is a beautiful city right across the strait from Taiwan, subtropical, just totally lovely, and really fell in love with the friends that I made and the Chinese language, history, culture, all of it. And my life ever since then has been pretty much entirely focused on China. And I went back and I lived in China from 2008 to 2012. I arrived in Beijing 1 week after the Beijing Olympics ended. And the sky was a beautiful blue, a very open, relatively open time to be there, very optimistic time to be there. And I learned Chinese, spent 2 years in a sort of full immersion environment. And when I came back to the US for a master's degree and then became a journalist in Washington, DC, focused on China and did 8 years based in Washington, DC, covering China. And during that time, I published some investigative pieces about the Chinese government's covert political interference in the United States. Those pieces I published starting in 2017, 2018. And in 2019, I was blacklisted by the Chinese government and was not permitted to enter for a journalism position that I had was given or was offered in Beijing. And last year, I moved to Taiwan. So I'm now based in Taiwan and still covering China, covering cross-strait relations, and covering Taiwan's efforts to strengthen itself, to become more resilient in the face of the Chinese government's unrelenting pressure on Taiwan. And you mentioned about the book. I first wrote the proposal for the book in 2019. And the reason I wanted to write a book was because as I was doing a lot of deep investigative work about the Chinese government's covert political interference in democracies, I was most focused on Beijing's power extension abroad. How was it extending its power, especially its authoritarian power? What was the main source and foundation of its power? And I came to feel through my observations and reporting that much of China's power is underlaid by its economy, the way that it uses its economy for geopolitical purposes beyond its border. And this is called economic statecraft, so that the use of economic power for geopolitical power. Lots of countries practice economic statecraft. The US, rather notorious for it with its sanctions regime, sometimes multilateral, et cetera. But the Chinese government has been quite innovative in the way that it has come up with new ways to use economic power to create geopolitical power, to use its economic power to pursue its core interests and to shape the behavior and decision-making of individuals, governments, companies, and multilateral institutions around the world to bring them more in line with the CCP's core interests.
Thank you very much. You described China's subtle but strategic aggressive efforts to rewrite and reshape the rules-based international order. Can you elaborate how that system that China benefited more than the United States and the rest of the world, and how it's been implemented?
Yes, so there's a whole wide-ranging ways that the Chinese government has, you can say, been free riding on economic, certainly on its membership, its accession into the WTO in 2001, and the way that it has benefited from the open markets around the world. I think that to sort of speak broadly to your question, what we've seen is, on the Chinese side, a linking of political behavior and economic behavior. So expecting that companies around the world will, for example, hand over their technology to Chinese companies in order to be granted access to the Chinese market. And you see hidden, in many cases, Chinese government subsidies of Chinese companies to give them an advantage, to give them the ability to start dominating an industry beyond China's borders. But at the same time, one of the things that has made that so successful is basically an unwillingness on the part of the US and Europe and other democratic countries to acknowledge that this is really happening and to do something about it. I mean, when it comes to, for example, forced technology transfers, US companies have been complaining of this for at least a decade. Yeah. But the US Trade Representative's office didn't really take it on as a major issue for quite a number of years. And I think what underlies that is, as you mentioned, a belief that soon, at some point in time in the glorious future, the Chinese government, Chinese economy, Chinese companies would start acting more like us, that they would move past this behavior, and soon they would start being more like us. And also, it's kind of like climate change. It's really hard to accept that human-made climate change is real because it's very scary, and it would require us to change, fundamentals of how we live. And I think that acknowledging the Chinese government's very successful use of economic coercion, both for economic and political purposes, is kind of like that, because it challenges the very nature of the rules-based international order on which we have built our societies and our governments and our multilateral institutions. It challenges the very legitimacy of the WTO and of the United Nations. And it would imply that we would have to take dramatic action to undo some of the decisions that we've made over the past 30 years and to really shake things up.
In that endeavor, can you speak to the notion that Rush Doshi wrote in his book, Blunt and Build, while blunting U.S. influence and building their own, taking up key positions in organizations like Interpol, ICAO.
Yeah, the United Nations is a great case study for this because the U.S. has in some ways really retreated from leadership of that organization for a variety of political and, I guess, funding reasons. And I think there has just been a lack of interest, generally speaking, in democratic societies and the US because we believed we won.
Yeah.
There was a complacency.
Yeah.
Yes, we won this battle, over authoritarianism and communism in the 1990s. And this, the UN is now basically, it's just for developing countries. It's just, to help keep the peace on the African continent and things like this. So we just really let it, stopped fighting for these things. And what the Chinese government did at the UN, across the UN, a very careful strategy for years, and a number of strategies that I will lay out. One of them was to erode human rights mechanisms and space within the UN. And they've done this in a variety of ways. One of them is this very, very specific and targeted approach where they have filled the UN with gongos. That's government-organized, non-governmental organizations, a very CCP thing. And they get accreditation, UN accreditation for these NGOs, these gongos. And then when there's a human rights hearing or event related to China, they will crowd the room with representatives from these gongos, who then will disrupt the event, will constantly interrupt the speakers, and prevent votes from being held or prevent those messages from coming across. Since the Belt and Road Initiative under Xi Jinping, more and more countries in the United Nations have signed on to it. And of course, Beijing says that it's a win-win, there's no strings attached. Of course, that's not true. And this is what we have seen in the UN. It's so clear, and I'll give two examples. When the Hong Kong National Security Law was introduced in 2020, there was a letter that was signed by 20 some odd nations and sent to I think it was the UN Office of the High Commissioner or UN Human Rights
High Commissioner's
High Commissioner's Office, condemning Beijing's authoritarian takeover of Hong Kong. And of those 20 some odd countries that signed this letter, none of them had signed on to the Belt and Road. Very shortly thereafter, there was a competing letter that was also sent to the High Commissioner's Office with even more countries, 30 some odd countries, supporting China's Hong Kong national security law. And every single one of those countries was either officially a member of the BRI or had signed a memorandum of understanding of some sort with China to cooperate with the BRI. And so you see this very, very clear sort of divide, that the way that the BRI in the United Nations has served to create a bloc that, when it comes to China-related issues, votes however Beijing or wants it to, or speaks out however Beijing wants it to. There's 15 specialized agencies at the United Nations, and there was, is it still, 4 of them are still run by a Chinese national, or is it 3 now? But let's say 4. 4 of them are headed by a Chinese national. Now, in an ideal world, and the world that the United Nations has wanted to create, people who are bureaucrats in the United Nations don't work on behalf of the country that they come from. They should be independent if they are working within the UN system, not as a representative of that country. But the Chinese government views its nationals as people that it owns and people who should always do exactly what Beijing wants first and foremost. And so when a Chinese national runs an independent agency at the United Nations, you see that agency doing things like excluding Taiwan. Yeah. And with ICAO, which is the aviation organization, at the beginning of the pandemic, right at the very beginning, ICAO did not share vital flight information with Taiwan regarding, should we start canceling flights? What's the deal with the pandemic border restrictions? They just shut Taiwan out of that, because they could. So this is an example of how the Chinese government uses its economic power to create diplomatic power and to push its interests at the United Nations. And I'll give one more example. The UN Secretary General has never tweeted criticism of China's genocide in Xinjiang. Or did he do it when there was finally that report? Did he finally? Yeah,
he mentioned it in passing.
He finally mentioned when there was this report that expressed grave concern about what was happening in Xinjiang, a report that had been held up for a long time. He finally mentioned it in passing. But he has not done so on other occasions. He has not said it's a genocide. And let's compare this with how the UN Secretary General frequently will, for example, express grave concern or condemn U.S. police brutality in the U.S., which is right. He should do that. But it's very clear that he holds his punches when it comes to China.
Exactly. I would love for you to talk more about the one specific issue, the China's core interest that you describe in the book, that CCP is willing to expand its definition to include major global issues that affect people far beyond the Chinese borders. And you specifically wrote that party is willing to use its full arsenal of leverage, influence, charm, deception, and coercion to achieve narrow political goals that intersect with maybe detrimental to national security and liberal democracy values of other countries, including the United States.
Yes. So in the work I was doing 6 or 7 years ago, I was looking at how the Chinese Communist Party would use covert operations run by the Ministry of State Security, or very quiet and perhaps covert, but certainly very quiet influence operations through the United Front Work Department and its proxy organizations and other forms of this, not softer influence, but not hard, not necessarily hard power, to try to marginalize dissent abroad and to amplify pro-Beijing voices. And what I found was that this kind of influence was deployed to protect China's core interests, which at the time, let's say circa 2017, would include anything territorial related, so Taiwan, Tibet, South China Sea, and then continually expanded to include other issues like Xinjiang and then Hong Kong. So we saw this kind of repression being targeted against Hong Kongers abroad. I have always viewed this as extremely serious and concerning because it demonstrates the potential of Chinese government power abroad. If they can do it for these issues, they can do it for other issues. But in some ways, it has been very hard. It was a few years ago very hard to get maybe some other people to take it seriously, because the argument was, well, this is extremely unfortunate for Taiwanese people, and it's really sad for Hong Kongers, and how unfortunate for Uyghurs abroad that they're facing this, but it doesn't really affect the rest of us. This is really sort of a niche issue, and I was always very, very upset with that argument. But what we saw at the beginning of the pandemic was that a new, essentially core interest of the Chinese government was suppressing free scientific inquiry and debate about the origins of the pandemic. And this is, having that debate and having, free scientific inquiry and investigations into where it came from is incredibly important to the health and well-being of literally every single person in the world, because it affected all of us. It's a key public health issue. But we saw the Chinese government working not only to suppress free inquiry, but also to try to hide the fact or to suppress the knowledge of the fact that it originated in China, which it obviously did. And so after that, it became, and as the Chinese government has become more and more brazen in using this kind of power, it has gotten a lot easier to present this kind of covert power to audiences, democratic audiences who understand that this is a comprehensive kind of global power that the Chinese government wields with increasing efficacy, and in fact is using the same kinds of ways to directly interfere in the electoral processes of democracies. And we're seeing this happening in Canada. Right now, just last week, there was a public inquiry announced into allegations of Chinese government interference in the 2019 and 2021 elections in Canada. In the UK, we're seeing it, of course, in Australia, in the United States, in New Zealand, and lots of other places.
Thank you. United Front Work Department is largely ignored in the United States, and you told some fascinating stories how this well-funded organization with over $1 billion budget that does not have apparently English website, why American people should be concerned and what kind of actions we possibly should be taking. If you can tell us some of the stories. I don't want to give up all of the stories that you wrote in the book, but I'd be interested in hearing more about it.
Yeah, so the United Front Work Department is, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is a bureau of the Chinese Communist Party, and it's existed for decades. And initially, primarily, its main remit was working within China to gain allies on behalf of the Chinese Communist Party. So its target audience, if you will, is people who are not party members. And it aims to amplify, again, pro-Beijing or pro-CCP sentiment and to marginalize any kind of dissenting voices. And it did that through reaching out to business leaders and religious leaders and rising community leaders, and through sort of China's fake civil society organizations like the All China Women's Federation and the All China Journalists Federation, and having a close relationship with them and ensuring that those organizations have been co-opted so that their goals are the same as the CCP's goals. And also to prevent the rise of an independent civil society. So for example, the United Front Work Department, if it notices in China that there's a young and rising community leader somewhere who's not in the party, they will maybe offer a position to that person in one of these organizations, the All China Women's Federation, for example, if it's a feminist, for example, and say, hey, yes, we see you're talented, come join this organization. And if they do, they get a platform and they get like an official way to talk, but then they can no longer say or do what they want. We have seen this kind of activity increasingly outside of China since the 1990s. And so it targets most directly and seriously overseas Chinese communities. So this same kind of co-opting through either the carrot or stick approach of what would have been independent community Chinese organizations in countries around the world. And the effect of that is that these sort of proxy organizations that exist in the United States and many other democracies look like organic civil society organizations, but aren't really. And they present themselves as speaking on behalf of the Chinese community, but they don't really. And this works both ways. So for example, if lawmakers want to speak to their Chinese American constituents, these organizations can have a really big convening power. And so you reach out to them and they filter that to the Chinese community, or the other way around. If there's concerns in the Chinese community, they get filtered in this way. This has a very serious effect on Chinese communities of restricting their own rights and freedoms that they deserve in the U.S. So, for example, if people in Chinese communities want to organize freely to talk about democracy, if they want to organize to talk about the Uyghur genocide, or about Taiwanese democracy, or to criticize the fact that Xi Jinping eliminated term limits, it is impossible to do that without risk. Right. And so there's a strong suppressing element on what should be protected free speech and organizing in the United States. And what I call for in my book as a way to push back against this kind of pressure is a focus on preserving and restoring the rights of overseas Chinese communities in the US and other democracies. What do I mean by that? By preserving, I mean ensuring that as our competition with China heats up, as we learn more and more about covert espionage and influence operations that the Chinese Communist Party does, to ensure that our security state does not overreach and end up infringing on the civil rights of Asian Americans and Chinese Americans, as we saw, for example, after 9/11 with Muslim communities in the US. They really faced very intense pressure. We don't want that, so preserving their rights. Restoring their rights is an emphasis on trying to give back that space to Chinese people in the United States who cannot publish freely in their own language or in English, who cannot organize freely around certain topics, who face surveillance and harassment and in some cases, in many cases, pressure on their families back home, even in some cases, fears of being actually kidnapped and taken back to China, to try to push back against that, to make sure that people here feel free and safe to speak and organize as they wish. So that's the emphasis I would put there, rather than a desire to root out the secret CCP agents in Chinese communities, which is, I think, a dangerous path to go down directly.
You wrote about something that is kind of part of my own life, transnational repression. You specifically wrote the Chinese citizens abroad and people of Chinese heritage are the first and last victim of this dynamic. And the Congress just held a hearing yesterday, and we've been hearing reports about the satellite police stations, I believe over 50 in Western Europe. State Department imposed visa restriction on unnamed Chinese individuals that are responsible for that kind of malign activities in the United States. And also, there have been indictments against Chinese individuals. How serious this problem is, why we're not being even more bold and aggressive at pushing back against this issue that to me is a sovereignty concern.
Yeah, it's a very serious issue. If you, for anyone who has, friends who are pro-democracy activists or leaders in the Uyghur community abroad, or who are people who engage in pro-Tibetan activism, these people, are very courageous, but also live under the knowledge that they are facing pressure all the time. And this has been going on for years. So it's a very serious problem. And I think it really, the fact that it's taken so many years for the US government and the US Department of Justice and American society at large to acknowledge this as a real issue and to take action on it is, in my opinion, kind of an expression of racism, the belief that what happened in Chinese-speaking communities or in Uyghur communities or in immigrant communities, it doesn't really count. It's not really an infringement on major U.S. civil rights. Well, of course it is.
Right.
For people to be constantly facing this much pressure and even digital pressure. And I'll give an example of Zhou Fengsuo, who was a Tiananmen student leader in 1989, came to the U.S. in the 1990s, and has continued his pro-democracy activism ever since. And he has faced so many examples of the Chinese government finding really clever ways to shut down his access to basic digital platforms, including Zoom, including LinkedIn. And so, for him, every time he opens an account on any kind of social media platform or anything like that, he knows he's very likely to face a Chinese state-backed attempt to shut him down on that platform every time he does anything. And that's how severe it is.
There have been some reports, actually, the other countries like Iran borrowing the pages from the CCP playbook and harassing, even trying to assassinate activists here in our country. It's a very serious problem. You mentioned Zoom. I know that some people in Washington still use Zoom, specifically those with a zoom.gov. Is this a safe platform that American people should continue to use?
I can't say
I know it sounds like a silly question, but I want the audience to
it's not.
hear
It's
from
not
you.
a silly question. I'm laughing because the evidence against Zoom is so dramatic.
You dedicate a whole chapter.
There's a whole chapter in my book all about how the Chinese government was able to use Zoom to surveil and collect information on people in the U.S. and then actually shut down accounts and meetings in the U.S. about Tiananmen and other meetings it didn't like. And just briefly how that happened was because Zoom has, at the time it had more than 700 employees in China. Now it's a U.S. company founded by a Chinese American, someone with American citizenship in California. Sorry, it's a U.S. company founded in the U.S. by an American citizen, but it had more than 700 employees in China, the members of its R&D team. And and what Zoom had disclosed was the reason it did that was because it saves money. It saves money on operating costs to have those employees there. And one of those employees, who Zoom had officially appointed as its liaison for China's intelligence and security services. That was his job, to talk to the Ministry of State Security and the Ministry of Public Security. He began implementing directives from the MSS and the MPS to do this, to subvert some of Zoom's own processes to surveil and shut down accounts in the US. So we know that this happened. Yeah. And Zoom, after the Department of Justice issued an indictment against that Zoom employee, they did not pull out of China. They did not move their employees outside of China. They fired that guy, but as long as it has employees in China, and as long as the Chinese government has things like the 2017 National Security Law, Article 7 of which says it is mandatory for any person and any entity in China to provide assistance to China's intelligence services upon request, and to keep that assistance a secret. This is by law, open, you can read it. As long as that remains law, it is not safe for any company that we use to talk to each other. That company itself is compromised.
Since we're talking about technology, I'd like to follow up and pick your brain on something that didn't cover much in the book, but why American people are not taking the Chinese technology platforms, specifically things like TikTok. As you have seen in the news today, that Europeans are much more serious. They just find TikTok a heavy penalty, 345 million euros for misusing children's data. Congressman Gallagher, Mike Gallagher, and FCC Commissioner Brendan Carr called TikTok as a digital fentanyl. And with that, with all the hearings, all the media coverage, why American people are still not getting it right?
I think there's a few reasons for that. And one of them is I think, a lack of understanding of what the Chinese government could possibly use TikTok for. I think that we still in our minds, there's so little understanding of what Marxism-Leninism is, of how the Chinese government operates. And I think sort of average people think, well, look, I'm looking at like a video of a dancing cat. Like, this is not communist propaganda. Like, this isn't hurting me. How could this possibly be dangerous? But that's not what it's about, of course. Like, Beijing isn't trying to like code secret messages into dancing cats to turn us into little hypnotic robots. Like, that's not what they do. They collect data. They have a latent, perhaps, degree of access to this that they could deploy at key moments to try to change narratives. There's lots and lots and lots of concerns of, like censorship that we know has happened, for example, with discussions of the Uyghur genocide on TikTok. It's an ability to generally and specifically shape our national narratives in ways that are favorable to Beijing. And in the digital era, when so much of our national discussion and mobilizing happens on digital platforms, we've just handed that over to Beijing. But I think a lot of people just don't understand that. 22-year-old like makeup artists and influencers don't understand that. And especially for people who have nothing to do with China, again, like makeup artists and influencers, their job is not dependent on that. They're never going to get censored. It's hard for them to see how concerning this is, which means that we need to have better messaging about it. And I think another one, I'll go back to this, for example, climate change as an issue. It's too scary. It's too scary to admit that this thing that we have on our phones and that we look at all the time and that lots and lots of people make their livelihoods from and that US political parties use to reach their constituents, and that is important in campaigns. It is too scary to acknowledge that this is something that is beyond now the oversight and control of the FCC or subpoenas from the Department of Justice. People don't understand this. And then third is, I think, a misunderstanding of what anti-Chinese racism is. It is not racist against Chinese people to acknowledge that a very large authoritarian political party uses as many covert methods as it can to push its authoritarian agenda abroad. That is completely not the same thing as racism, but I think that becomes conflated in our national dialogue, sometimes because out of good intentions, because people are genuinely and rightly concerned about the rights and safety of Chinese people and people of Asian descent in our country. But also that particular narrative gets pushed through disinformation channels. So the Chinese state, which is very fond of this narrative, oh, don't you dare, try to contain us because that's racist. They love this, and so they amplify that as well.
Thank you. That's very insightful. Let's talk about Taiwan. You live in Taiwan. I have been visiting Taiwan for work or public speaking many times. I can't even count. I was in Taiwan last August, 3 weeks after Speaker Pelosi's trip. Right before I left Washington, the Chinese ambassador to France said twice that the Taiwanese people's minds are intoxicated with Tsai Ing-wen's separatist ideology, and the Taiwanese people must be re-educated. I mean, as somebody who survived the re-education camp, that had such a strong resonance in me. So I've been trying to tell through my public remarks, comments, that the Taiwanese people should take that kind of remarks very seriously. And in my trip last week, I see people much more calmer And if you could comment on the public sentiment, public opinion, apparently dropped, specifically Taiwanese people's negative opinion to CCP, even compared to South Korea and Japan, are lower today in Taiwan. Why is that? Why that is happening? Is it also have something to do with the Chinese influence operations in Taiwan?
When you say public opinion has dropped,
towards CCP.
it's become, the CCP has become less and less popular.
Yes. No, actually, the negative opinion dropped towards CCP has dropped to about 40% from the previous year or previous survey.
Yeah. I mean, I can't speak to specifically, like, what has caused that, specifically. I don't know for sure, but I can provide ideas. It is absolutely the case that Taiwan is basically ground zero for Chinese government disinformation, online disinformation operations. Taiwan faced that before anybody else. And in fact, that's true of all of basically China's covert influence operations and also its economic coercion. Originally, what was deployed towards Taiwan, and also a lot of its economic coercion around the world is for the purpose of isolating Taiwan. So when the Chinese government punishes countries like Lithuania, for example, when it tried to basically issue its equivalent of secondary sanctions on Lithuanian-made products, it was because Lithuania had allowed Taiwan to open an office in Vilnius. And was improving its unofficial relationship with Taiwan. So Taiwan is like ground zero for all of this. And the Taiwanese civil society, which is very vibrant, there's a wonderful organization there called Doublethink Lab, which has been, really led the world in its research of Chinese government-backed disinformation operations. And Puma Shen, who co-founded it, has gone around and given briefings, for years now to other foreign government officials about how Chinese government disinformation works. Right. And a narrative that we're seeing very strongly right now in Taiwan, more than last year, more than the year before, is that if the Taiwanese government were to let up on some of its very, very pro-U.S. policies, or very, very strongly like we don't want to be close to China policies. If it were to let up on some of those policies, then the Chinese government would also let up on its pressure campaign on Taiwan. Now, are there Taiwanese people who truly and genuinely, organically think that? Absolutely. Is this a narrative that is very beneficial to Beijing? Mm-hmm. Yes. Mm-hmm. And we definitely see efforts to amplify that, to reward people who say that, to reward KMT politicians who say that, to reward retired generals who say that, to grant more access to Taiwanese business people who promote that idea. So there is a wide-spanning attempt by Beijing to amplify this idea. And it is something that many Taiwanese people believe. And so coming into an election in January, so Tsai Ing-wen has stepped down as leader of the DPP. She's definitely not going to be president. Who is? It's really an open field. It could be the DPP candidate, more traditionally, the party that views its security as most inherently tied up in having a very close relationship with the U.S. The KMT, which is not pro-unification, but views having a close relationship with Beijing as a good way to guarantee Taiwan's security. And then now we have two independent candidates. So if the Chinese government were able to convince more Taiwanese people that if Taiwan would just stop buying weapons from the U.S., if Taiwan would just stop sending officials to the U.S., if Taiwan would stop, trying to promote itself in Europe, then the Chinese government would just let Taiwan be. Now this, then potentially maybe the KMT candidate would be voted in. Now, would the Chinese government give up its desire to annex Taiwan if there were a KMT president? No, it's very clear that Xi Jinping has made an actual tangible goal of retaking Taiwan in some way. Yeah. So this is not true. It is not true that Taiwan would be more secure if it just does what Beijing wants. But this is certainly a narrative we're seeing.
You talked about the companies, entities, countries cross Beijing's line and face retaliatory actions. The case of Liu Xiaobo and the Cathay Pacific, Nike, H&M, Hollywood, NBA, what can be done about this? Is this like, a self-inflicted wound, or, this, we still have a large American business presence in China. I know that some reports indicate that some companies are readjusting, leaving, investing less in China, but what does this kind of pressure of countries or entities tell us about CCP's intention?
Yeah. So what I see when I see, for example, here's how it is. Basically, every CEO of every company in the world that has business interests in China knows that its speech and its behavior must align with CCP core interests. Yeah. This is possibly the world's most successful PR campaign. And so on a 10,000-foot level, what that means is that the Chinese government has very effectively linked authoritarian political values with international economic behavior. It has done that very effectively. What we have not seen from the US side and from Europe and other democratic countries is a countervailing democratic pressure. We have not, in fact, tried to create democratic regulations on international economic behavior that push back against China's authoritarian regulatory framework. What's the result of that? The result of that is that every one of these struggles ends up being the entire Chinese Communist Party and government against the NBA, or against Apple, or against Google. So it's this huge, authoritarian government against one company. That fight is like this. It's not a contest of equals. And so of course the Chinese government wins that fight every single time. How could they not? There's nothing wrong with naming and shaming these companies for giving in, for self-censoring, for handing over information about Chinese citizens to the Chinese government. That's obviously wrong behavior, and it's fine to name and shame them. But it is not nearly enough. It is not enough. And in some ways, it's also not reasonable. Basically, what we're doing is putting CEOs on a moral pedestal and saying, you should just be better. You should just be better human beings than the rest of us and be willing to give up hundreds of millions of dollars for democratic values, right? I mean, it's not reasonable. What we should do is to pass regulations and create multilateral mechanisms that change the regulatory structure and make it not a contest of Beijing versus individual companies, but of the Chinese government versus the US government. That's what regulations do. It's not right to think of them as constraining US company behavior in this case. Rather, what it's doing is elevating this struggle to a government-to-government struggle. That is a contest of equals. Let me give just one specific example of what this might look like. There's been a lot of, people say, well, you can't, we're a democratic country, you can't regulate free speech. You can't pass a law saying that US companies must tweet in support of the Hong Kong pro-democracy protests. Of course we can't do that, nor would we want to. Here's what we can do. The US government could sanction or put on the Commerce Department entities list several of the top Chinese companies that are most complicit in creating the architecture of censorship that is now universal across China. So for example, Baidu, sanction Baidu, sanction Tencent, and a few others. What would this do? It would create a halo of deterrence around censoring or self-censoring on behalf of a foreign authoritarian government. The US sanction regime is notorious for creating what they call a halo of deterrence. It's just companies want to stay as far away from that behavior as possible. It would also make it impossible for US companies to form joint ventures with these companies. So if, for example, Google, a few years ago, was secretly creating a bespoke pre-censored search engine known as Project Dragonfly, circumventing their own internal ethics mechanisms to do it. And to do that, they would have to partner with a Chinese company. Having a sanction on that Chinese company would prevent Google from being able to do that in the first place. This is what I mean about putting US power and US regulations in a way that provides countervailing pressure to abide by international liberal and democratic norms.
You mentioned you talked about Disney. We have been in, I personally participated in some conversation with the Disney executives about the movie Mulan, that they credited a police department that was
in Xinjiang.
Yeah, in Xinjiang, in the midst
That was
of
specifically involved in helping run
and
mass
they refused to
internment
take it down even to this day.
Oh, yeah.
So let's talk about a fascinating topic, Australia.
Okay.
You discuss Australia's significant role in waking Western policymakers to China's nefarious activities on the international scene. You mentioned a few names that I'm also familiar with. I had the chance to interview for my own book, John Garneau.
Yes.
And also you mentioned Vice President's speech here at the Hudson Institute in October 2018. That to me was a major speech, specifically on the Uyghur issue as well. Talk about the significance. Can you elaborate how did we get where we are today in the China conversation?
Yes. So Australia was basically the first democratic country, other than Taiwan, to openly talk about China's covert political interference operations in democracies. And the first speech was where someone mentioned that was when the then Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull gave a speech at, I believe it was Shangri-La in Singapore that year, and mentioned that the Chinese government was doing this. And that was the first time any leader of a country had mentioned that in a speech. And how did he get to that point? This was the result of a confluence of factors, but one of them was the role of John Garneau, who was previously been a journalist, done a lot of investigative work in Australia and China about China's covert political influence abroad, including in Australia. And he had been brought on by Malcolm Turnbull first as his speechwriter, where he was able to have a lot of one-on-one time with Turnbull and kind of explaining this to him. And then a little bit later, as the head of Garneau was tasked with writing an intelligence report that documented China's political interference in Australian democracy and society. And because of Turnbull's efforts to make this public, because that report, an unclassified version was released publicly, because people got lawmakers talking about what was happening, and because of a few scandals that happened at that time, including an Australian lawmaker who accepted money from a United Front leader in Australia and then proceeded to publicly support China's position in the South China Sea, which went against Australia's own position. It ignited this furious debate in Australia about the way that the Chinese government was trying to influence Australian elections to make them more favorable to Beijing. What's so interesting is that in 2020, so after Scott Morrison called for an independent inquiry into the coronavirus origins, and Australia was the subject of a lot of Chinese economic coercion, the Chinese government issued what it would call the 14 grievances against Australia, and accused it, among other things, of following the U.S. lead in turning against China. What is actually ironic is that in some ways it was actually the U.S. that was following Australia's lead. So as I said, in 2017 is when Turnbull gave this speech. The first major speech, or really any speech, by a U.S. government official that talked about China's covert political influence, that presented the idea that the Chinese Communist Party was trying to interfere in other countries' societies and democracies was, as you said, Mike Pence in his speech at Hudson in October 2018. So this was more than a year later. And we didn't really have our debate in the U.S. didn't really take off, in fact, for another couple of years. And at this time, U.S. government officials were, of course, U.S. and Australia, they're both in the Five Eyes. There's always intelligence sharing going on. But, U.S. officials were looking at Australia, learning from Australia, inviting John Garneau and other, key figures leading this sort of debate in Australia to the U.S. to brief people here. So really, Australia had a very important role, including in policies that the U.S. ended up adopting as well.
Did John Garneau was sued by this influence operator and won in the Australian court, right?
He lost. John Garneau lost.
Yeah, John Garneau lost.
Yeah, he lost. So one of his stories, you can, what are they called? Waging lawfare. We've seen this. We've seen this strategy from Chinese Communist Party linked people outside of China. So using libel laws, these very, very, very strict libel laws in Australia and the UK, to sue journalists who've published things that are obviously true. I won't get into the details of it, but yeah, because of that, one particular person, is it Huang Xiangmo? Is it the other? It's Chao Chok-wing.
Yeah, Chao Chok-wing.
Chao Chok-wing. You basically can't. It's in Australia.
It's a billionaire.
You basically can't mention anymore that Chao Chok-wing, a United Front linked Australian billionaire, is United Front linked. You basically can't do it anymore.
That's.
You can do it in the U.S.
You didn't cover much about the Chinese leadership, the power dynamic within the Chinese system, the CCP in your book, but I wanted to get your perspective on the recent events, specifically in the context of China's attempts to expand its influence around the world, specifically through regional global organizations. Yeah. Xi Jinping has been in the news a lot since his attendance in the BRICS in South Africa. And now we know that he didn't show up for the G20 and he's not coming to New York for UNGA. To me, it's a little bit confusing. What could be the possible reason for China taking this type of step?
Yeah, I think there's two possible explanations. This is quite a new trend, I think. So what we have come to expect from China's leaders, and especially Xi Jinping, is that he's sort of an equal opportunity, like diplomat or a leader. He wants to. He wants to go to he wants to have good, he wants to have close relations with every country as long as they do it on Beijing's terms. And he wants to lead every multilateral organization, yeah. And have push China's influence in every existing organization, as well as starting his own, as well as having China's own, growing constellation of its own, like Beijing-centered multilateral organizations. This has been the received wisdom. This is definitely how he has acted. But what we've seen just really in the past few weeks is that Xi Jinping did not go to the G20. Yeah. He didn't go to ASEAN, right? He didn't go to the ASEAN summit. He's not going to go to UNGA. I feel like there's one more that he's skipping.
He possibly may not be coming to the APEC in San Francisco.
Yeah, I would be really surprised.
He's sending vice president to UNGA instead of even his foreign minister.
So he's not doing that. Now, one possible explanation is that Xi Jinping is dealing with so many domestic problems that he's just too busy. I mean, we see that. We see that from U.S. presidents, and they get criticized for this. Oh, like Biden or whoever skipped ASEAN or skipped APEC or whatever. Sometimes when we have stuff going on at home, they stay. We don't expect that from Xi Jinping. And if that's the reason that he's staying in China, that is not what we have come to expect from him. And now that he keeps skipping more and more, I'm wondering, and what we're wondering is he changing strategies? Is he shifting away somewhat from trying to gain leadership in existing multilateral organizations in favor of promoting his own, or those in which that are already not pro-Western or have no ties to the West? So, for example, BRICS expanding to include 6 new, basically all authoritarian members, and more openly promoting itself as a counterweight to Western institutions. And just recently, was it this week or last week, the Chinese government put out a paper or a big press release on global governance. So Xi Jinping's view or China's view on global governance. So right timed with all of him skipping all of these big summits, having this big vision of global governance and what that looks like. And it does seem to me that there has been a sudden sort of shift in policy here. And I don't know if it's because he feels that the Chinese government has not been able to get its way in these organizations sufficiently, and that he now wants, instead of co-opting them, to actually sideline them. It seems like maybe that's where we're going.
Thank you. For the remainder of our time, I have 2 questions. One is relating to our apparent embrace of or mixing up cooperation with competition aspect in the U.S.-China relations. What is a proper way to balance and to sequence actions? Or should we just simply embrace the competitive aspect? We hear that more these days in the policy speeches made by our senior government officials. And also, towards the end of your book, you made some thoughtful recommendations, including relinking trade with democratic values and human rights, and making new laws and regulations at home through multilateral institutions. I think it's a brilliant idea. As somebody who's also in the midst of this, naming, shaming corporate entities, both domestic and foreign, has not been very effective. I'm a compliance lawyer by training. If you don't put a strong regulatory measures in place, the corporate boardrooms don't pay attention to you. So if you can elaborate on those 2 points, would be great.
Yes. So I think, and as you know, we are facing we don't want to fully decouple from the Chinese economy. It's not possible, and it would, I think, cause it would cause so much disruption and so much pain around the world. And I think it would create a much greater risk for actual war, which we don't want. I definitely think that de-risking is which is a more targeted approach in certain industries to having sort of a selective decoupling. I think that's great, but overall. I think the guiding principle of U.S. competition with China should be our values, should be democratic rights, political rights, and human rights. What is national security for? What are we doing this competition for? Any country can have national security. China can have national security. North Korea can have national security. National security is not the end. It's the means by which we achieve the end, which is preserving our democratic rights and extending them as far as we can around the world. And I think that is a very clear, that I think clarifies a lot of answers. And we were talking before the event about John Kerry and how he has basically been pushing to elevate solutions to climate change over human rights. And this matters very directly in Xinjiang, where there's forced labor in solar panels. And so people are saying, well, we just have to ignore that because we need these solar panels. And that is it's so the wrong approach. I mean, what are we doing all of this for? We can't just be like, oh, genocide is fine in this one region so that we can have solar panels. That's, ridiculous. Right. So I think that's the true north by which we should orient ourselves. And I think that can also help prevent some of the excesses that we saw, for example, in the Cold War. A lot of people are asking, are we in a new Cold War? Is that even the frame we should be applying to all of this? And I think a really huge problem with the U.S. approach during the Cold War was that we did not, or at least for many years and for many policies, we did not center human rights or political rights. It became all about just realpolitik, just how can we push our geopolitical interests through any means necessary. And that resulted in some of the excesses in foreign policy that we saw during that time and domestically. I think it is important to try to maintain the idea that cooperation with the Chinese government can be possible if it is in certain targeted areas, if it is done with a demonstrated commitment to never give up on our core values, and if it's done in a very clear way with lots of defensive briefings, lots of clarity on what the Chinese side actually means when they say certain things, that they're not necessarily agreeing to something. So I think we can't give that up. Yeah. But I think that it is so important to not be afraid to push for, very clearly for U.S. dominance in emerging technologies and in, AI, because the Chinese government will use that for authoritarian purposes, not just for its own neutral geopolitical interests, but for authoritarian purposes. And the U.S. government and European governments and Japan and South Korea have a right, I believe a moral right, to push for dominance in these fields, not just to make money, but so they don't become co-opted by an authoritarian government.
Thank you very much. In the competition aspect, thank you for mentioning the solar panel. So how do we compete with a country that subsidizes that industry, steal our technology, use dirty coal and slave labor? It's impossible to even compete, and it's a misleading notion that some politicians, some people telling American people, we need to be honest about that. And then the cooperation, and one important issue, which is the public health. The Chinese precursors for fentanyl crisis still keep coming. We lost about 100,000 people last year, and 70% of those died as a result of fentanyl overdose. So Bethany, thank you very much. It's a fascinating conversation. I salute you for your courage to write this book. I was so impressed by your storytelling ability and the investigative journalistic nature of the facts and all the sources that you cited. It's fascinating. I highly recommend who's tuning in, if you haven't buy you a copy, it's available on Amazon. Can I give a star so that algorithm will tell Amazon?
Thank you, thank you. You're an author, you understand.
So writing book is very, very involved process, and I wanted to thank you. Thank you for being truth teller. It's been an honor to know you and work with you.
Thank you. I feel the same, and I'm not courageous. I don't have family in China. You do, and you have personally experienced what happens when you speak freely and when you lead abroad. I know that you're not able to see family members.
Thank you. Thank you.
That is, that's far more of a price than I will ever pay. So thank you,
Bethany. Thank you. Thank you all for participating in this event today. Those of you in the audience and tuning in online. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.